Don't get me wrong, I love Tailwind CSS, but there are 3 trouble spots that I found solutions for that have made my experience so much better. The first one has to do with organizing class names. It's helpful to keep class names organized in the same way so that every time you return to a component or you start working in a Tailwind file, it's really easy to tell what you've added and what else you need to add. So there is actually a way to auto sort classes, and that's what I want to show you. The second problem has to do with merging conflicts. Now, of course, in the same file, if you start to type the same exact class name or something similar to it, it will tell you, hey, you've already got a background color on this, for instance. But what happens when you're passing it is a prop? Well, it doesn't actually catch that, and often you don't catch it either because whatever you've added most recently in Tailwind is added to the bottom of that CSS file as it's compiled. And it's not until you restart dev mode that you recognize you have a problem, and it's often much later, and then suddenly you've got to go track that down. The third problem has to do with conditional classes, especially when you want it to be more dynamic, like passing in background and then optionally either gray or blue or whatever the color happens to be, and then 500 or 600. Now, if you've worked with Tailwind for any length of time, you know that you can't do that because Tailwind has to see the entire class name written out so that it knows to generate it. Now, of course, you can tell Tailwind in the Tailwind config, hey, generate these exact classes, but at that point, you're just doing extra work for yourself. So is there a way to have conditional classes that you don't have to worry about or manually kind of keep up to date? So I found solutions for all 3 of these problems, and that's what I want to share with you in this video. Hey, what's up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. I've got a very basic repo up here with just a single landing page, and you can follow along if you want to by grabbing the code on the main branch, or you can look at the finished code under finalized code. We're going to use this, though, to look at some must-have Tailwind tools. The very first one has to do with class sorting. If I were to open up my app.jsx file, and I were to look at some of these classes, you can see that they're just kind of randomly sorted. Now, some of these are maybe the order I would typically do it, but others of them may not be. So for instance, maybe I'd come in here and say, hey, normally I'd move like the small declarations all in one little section. So it's important to have those things consistent. So when you go back to look at a Tailwind file, especially something that has tons and tons of classes in it, then it's really easy to discern exactly where you need to add things and just make sure that you don't conflict. Now, of course, if you come in here and do like a text 6XL or something like this, if you've got the Tailwind extension, which I'm assuming you do, then you can see that it actually gives you some intelligence to tell you, hey, you can't declare the same thing. But it's still important to be able to mentally sort all this out. So how do you do this? Well, it's with something called Prettier, and they actually have this as part of Tailwind you can install. All you have to do is come down here and grab this install script. You're going to install both Prettier and the plugin for Prettier for organizing your Tailwind. So once that installs, it should automatically work for you kind of depending on your individual setup. So I'll do npm run dev, and let's see if this works for me. So I'm going to go ahead and save it. And nothing really reorganizes. Now, I think it's because I'm using this Prettier extension. So there's one more thing I found I have to do, and that is to come in here and add a .prettier rc file. And then I simply have to have an object in here with plugins, and I just have to pass it the name of the plugin. So that would be this right here, and then it works for me. And again, I think that's because I'm using Prettier in VS Code. So now if I come over here and I save one more time, it should reorganize those classes, and you see that it's done that. Now, the important thing here is that it's reorganizing them in a way that's consistent all across all of your projects. But the other thing to note is that we'll actually do it in the same order in which your CSS file is generated. So for instance, if I come down here, you can see that obviously if you're like thinking through this, you're going to say, first of all, I would expect their CSS to be generated where the generic class would come first and all of these override classes would come later. And that's exactly how they style their CSS. Now, you can write it this way. It's not going to be any different because it's not the class order here. It's the class order in the CSS file because that's how the cascade works. But they're also ordering it the same way just to make sure that that mental model carries over to where you're writing your actual classes. So that's the first tool I wanted to show you about, and it has to do with organizing your classes properly. Now, the second tool is really, really important, and the problem is a little bit more sinister. And what we're going to do is look down here. I've got 2 link components, and I could have named these things anything, and I would obviously make these more robust in a real example, but they're right under here under a link component. And you can see what I've got here is just a anchor link, and I'm passing in an href. I'm passing in some like default classes here, and then I'm allowing the user to pass in additional class names via props. Everything then wraps the children, which is just whatever happens to be inside of it. In this case, it's just like text, right? Okay, so that's what I've got over here on both of these buttons, and that's why I've got like all of these classes being passed in afterwards. Obviously, this is probably not how I would do it. I would actually either create some kind of default classes or use something like the CVA library to do that, but in this case, you can see it's a pretty simple example. Now, there are two problems we have here is conflicting classes and then conditional classes. So conflicting classes, what I mean by that is if I were to come over here and I would add something, I don't know, let's say said something like background amber 400, and I went ahead and save that, you'll see that both of these are generated and they both look like they're amber, even though this comes in afterwards, because remember, it's the class name in the CSS file, not the order here inside your file. However, I'm not getting any IntelliSense to tell me that I passed one in here, and I've also passed in a background color here, and I don't remember how I did here. No, I don't think I did over here. So you can see that I'm not getting any IntelliSense telling me that I basically have conflicting classes. So how is it ordered? Well, it's basically just whatever happens to be generated first. Now, you can explore that actually in the CSS. So if I were to come in here, and let's select this right here. So if I scroll down this way, you're going to see that I've got background amber 400 right here. If I search, however, and just look for the dot background, you'll see I do have a background white, but that's being overwritten because, again, in the CSS, this happens to fall in the cascade in a different way. Now, the way that the Tailwind dev experience works is whatever I basically add most recently. So if I said like blue 400, then that would show then. If I said emerald, then that would show as well. So it's basically just whatever I add most recently. However, I can close down the dev server and restart it. And now it just kind of depends, doesn't it? So you'll notice in this case, this one is not being overwritten because I'm actually not passing in a custom color, but this one is. Now, why is that? Well, when it regenerates that CSS file, it basically combs through it all, and I think it's either doing it intelligently or just doing it by alphabet. But either way, you'll see that it's not consistent. So that's the first problem, that is conflicting classes, especially when you're dealing with props and more dynamic components. The second problem is conditional classes. So let's say I came in here and I had something like pending, and we're going to set this to true. So if this is pending and I'll receive this as a prop over this way, then maybe I want to add some kind of custom class over this way. So let's just say I came over here and I said background, and then inside here I said pending. If this is pending, I want it to be gray. Otherwise, I want this to be, I don't know, let's say blue, and then we'll do, I don't know, like 500 or 600 for either. Now, you may think this will work, but the problem is that there's no actual class written out, bg-gray 600 or whatever. So Tailwind doesn't know what to do with this. So even though this is pending, I've got no gray class showing over here. Now, we could kind of hack around this if we want to. So I could come up here and just do like const string or something and do background gray 600 just to show you this will work. And now that it sees this somewhere written out, it'll generate that class for you. That just-in-time compiler saves you from all these extra classes being generated, but the problem is you can't do this kind of dynamic work over here. So you've got conditional classes, and then you've also got these conflicting classes. Well, the solution I'm going to recommend to you is something called Tailwind Merge. You can see that all you have to do is import this, and then you simply pass it your defaults, and then everything you pass in the next kind of section of this function will override the previous ones. And it does this really intelligently. So let's go ahead and grab this. I guess first of all, we should probably install it. So let me grab this right here, and we'll go ahead and install it. And I'll get this back up and running. And let's just grab this import right here, and I'll dump it up top. Now what I'm going to do in this case is get rid of all of this, and we'll replace it with TW merge. Then inside here, we'll first of all pass all of the string options. So let's get rid of this right here. And I'll go ahead and close this off early. Then we'll do a comma. In this case, I don't need to wrap this in some kind of template literal string. I can just simply pass in whatever class names came in as props. So at its very most basic, if I come back over here, you'll notice that anything I pass in afterwards will override the other ones. And it doesn't matter the order or when the dev server starts or all that kind of stuff. It intelligently figures out kind of how that works. Now, if I come down here, let's see, back to the Tailwind merge. Here they'll tell you how to use it, what it's used for. You can look through all these different things, look at the API reference, but generally speaking, what it's going to do is intelligently kind of merge everything. So here I've got px2, py1, but it recognizes that if I pass in p3, it should get rid of all of these and only have this as part of the declaration. So let's go ahead and try that out. So here we go, right over this way. If I came in here and I said something like p5, all right, and I came back over this way, and now let's go ahead and select this. You're going to notice that I've just got P5 on there. I don't have all those other default classes. Now, if we were to come back here and remove everything we just did, you'll notice we've got a problem. I've got this PX, I've got the PY, and I do have P5 coming later, so it actually does apply, but that's just because it happens to be further down in the cascade. These are still here, they're still conflicting classes. Now the Tailwind merge removes that as a possibility. Now remember, there was another problem that we needed to fix, and that was the conditional classes. And I can actually now wrap this just like this in a string, and it will basically figure this out for me. And you'll notice that it has background gray 600 right over here, even though I don't have it anywhere declared. It's smart enough to figure out it needs to generate that class, so it passes it on to Tailwind. Now you can also do other things. Let's say, for instance, in this case, I'd say, hey, if this was pending, then I want to just generate like gray, whatever. So I could come in here and add it just like this and say, then I want it to be background gray, I don't know, 600. And you'll notice that if it's pending, then it will add that to it. If it's not, it does not do that. Now, note that you cannot do objects, so you can't do it like this and kind of reverse this. So if you're used to more JSX style syntax, this does not work. Now, they've actually been very intentional about that, and there is another library you can use if you want to. It's called CSS, and what it basically does is allow you to pass in anything from like strings to objects to arrays to maps, all this kind of stuff, and it basically just figures out what the final CSS classes should be. In fact, Astro, which I love so much, has this basically built in with their class::list directive. Now, if you really want to do this, there are some great examples of how that's done with Tailwind libraries like shadcdn, for instance. Maybe you've seen before people use like a cn class here. All this is doing is basically taking the CLSX and then wrapping Tailwind merge inside of that. And that way you get the benefit of being able to do things like this, but also all the benefits of the intelligent merging from Tailwind. Now, if you're interested in a video on how to set up that cn function yourself, or if you're interested in this shadcdn library, which I'd love to do a video on in some time, please let me know in the description. But I hope these couple of tips helped you when it comes to working with Tailwind. They've saved my bacon more than once, and I hope they'll be a help to you. All right, thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Happy coding.